Mm. So, I mean, I guess you could say that there's kind of, very broadly speaking, two kinds of international relations, right? There's the field of academic study, or at least since the Cold War, has been crafted around a theoretical canon, and which is fairly US centric, and after that quite Eurocentric, which professes to explain the causes and consequences of war, and aspirations for peace from that centrism, right? Much of it is crafted through a conceptual and empirical separation of the field itself from the wars, the power struggles, the struggles for liberation and for justice, which were going on in the world at the time, both within the West and also outside of the West, so to speak. Right. And so it's a field which is always surprised when the world doesn't work how it thinks it should work, and is always presenting the world as a hieroglyph, as something like, why did they do that? Why did they suddenly do that? And it's usually to do with disorder, right? Why don't they want our help? Why do they hate us? Which was the big line after 9/11, right? So that's one field, and within that field you have people on the so-called margins who, try to deconstruct the premises and the pretensions of this field, and often using it to some people call the minor traditions of European thought, to try and deconstruct and critique the corpus of knowledge that makes up IR. And within that you could see much of what we do in one way, right? And much of what we do is kind of on the cusp of that world and another world. And the other world is an intellectual world just the same, but it's a world comprised of peoples, and this is not geographically distinct. So these people can be within the so-called West as well as outside of it, but their focus is on substantial issues to do with empire, colonialism and its legacies, the names of which resonate around the world, things like freedom and rights, but which take on very significantly different forms in different places, right? And these people are often practitioners, sometimes they're not. They are in a huge extended conversation, often frictional, but nonetheless always shared. And their corpus is partially written down, it's partly remembered, and it's often transmitted through practice and convention. And this is the, for want of a better term, the anti-colonial international relations. And we who do this kind of post-colonial or decolonial or anti-colonial work in IR, however, or critical race work, however we want to, I mean, there are differences in the words, but let's just put that aside for a moment. We're kind of on the edge. So we're in one IR, and some of us are more in the other IR than others, but there's this necessary link and commitment to the other international relations. A very cardinal principle for me is this, right? That there is an imposition of power, right? But the response is never indebted to the imposition, right? And that to me is absolutely fundamental, right? So the easiest way to imagine that is to say, the French enslaved, but they also had this idea of freedom, equality, liberty, equality, fraternity, right? And so the enslaved responded to the French imposition by taking the best of the French, right? So that the response is indebted to the imposition. So there couldn't have been a Haitian revolution without the French Declaration of Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, even if the French were doing the enslaving, right? So one can see that in the title of C.L.R. James's famous book, Black Jacobins. So the Jacobins is the noun, the Jacobins are the doers, and then the adjective is the black, so it qualifies the noun, right? But black just qualifies the noun. The Jacobins are French, right? And CLR kind of rethinks this a little bit later on in his life, okay? So my point is that there are resources which are always already there, which make the response not dependent upon the imposition. I was partially trained in political economy, right? And especially kind of history of classical political economy. That's a lot of what I did in my undergraduate degree and partially in my PhD, right? A kind of critical political economy for me helps one to explain, uncover, unpack the imposition. But critical political economy often doesn't help you to figure out the response, right? It only helps it if you imagine that the response is indebted to the imposition. So a political economy of the Haitian Revolution would presume, right, that revolt and revolution happens on the plantation, because the plantation is the site of extraction and capital accumulation. But in actual fact, most revolts, rebellions, revolutions in the plantation world don't start on the plantation. They start in the hills and in the forests and the swamps behind the plantation. So that tells you something very important, right, about the autonomous nature of the response. I did a book on called The Black Pacific, and this was very much about the response, right? And I was doing a lot of work as well on the 1930s and the response from the African diaspora to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, also in India as well. And this was all about the response, yeah. And then Brexit happened, and I just got so pissed off with the illiteracy of not only the right, which you would expect, yeah. Although I actually think the Conservatives are more literate than the left when it comes to race, actually, but especially with the left, and the illiteracy to do with understanding nation, class, empire, and race, and how all these things come together to inform a classification of populations, which is all about deserving and undeserving. And for me, race is classification. So that's why in that book I say, pithily, class is race, because this is about classification. So then I found myself going back to the kind of more political economy way and trying to put a contribution on the table, saying, okay, let's just look at the imposition and let's just explain the imposition. Do you get what I'm saying? Now, since then I've been trying to do some other stuff, going back to the responses, but I'm kind of thinking that whilst the center of gravity of my work is on the response, it's okay sometimes to also, dwell on the imposition. But the problem lies is if you think that the response is indebted to the imposition, that's there. No. The idea of who is deserving of welfare and social security is a racialized one, right? So the classification between deserving and undeserving poor is a fundamentally racialized one, which, in my estimation, first becomes significantly and properly racialized in the British Empire in the late 1700s during the abolition era. Then that racialization shifts coordinates, in different ways over different kind of eras. All of these eras are pronounced by struggles and crises of empire. The most recent one being Brexit. That is the basic argument, that what we see in this racist populism is I don't know if it's a final. It seems final at the moment, but maybe it's not. Reckoning with empire, actually, and in all of that, the point is that from when you racialize peoples and populations into deserving and undeserving groups, even if initially you might be on the deserving side, ultimately that racialization is going to come up and bite you and get you. And one of the key examples in the book is that in 1948, National Welfare Act does something very, very significant. It effectively gets rid of the criteria for means testing, right? For if you are deserving of welfare or social security. And means testing was the main principle of the poor laws going back to the Elizabethan era. So this is an amazing thing, right? Now, there's other things which happened in 1948, which is it circumscribes that to people living in the UK rather than, you know, all subjects and citizens of the British Empire. Nonetheless, in Britain, it becomes your right to access welfare and social security is not determined on whether you deserve it or not, right? Now, the first time where that principle becomes rescinded and that principles of means testing and partiality are reintroduced into the provision of welfare and social security is in 1999, I think, when the Labour government says that asylum seekers are not automatically allowed to claim welfare and social security. And right now, no one in Britain has that automatic right. So you know, the point with this racialization is that unless you're that 0.1%, it's gonna bite you in the end. If you keyword search someone who and they talk about race, but you don't see the keyword class, it does not mean that they're not providing a class analysis. Same way the other way around, and also with gender. Many class analyses I can think of deal with race way better than so-called race analyses, right? So the first thing is that we have to slow down a little bit, try and come to terms with the kind of grammar and syntax of people's work, right? And that this is not simply a rush to keyword search kind of thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is more to do with the genealogies of concepts that come from political economy. There is a reading of political economy, and especially its kind of classical genesis, so to speak, in the 1700s, which waylays empire, waylays colonialism, and as importantly, and perhaps even more so, entirely waylays the whole abolition debate. So for me, the abolition debate it's at least one of the big geneses, if you like, of political economy, right? And if you read political economy as part of an abolition debate, it absolutely makes no sense to think about class and race as analytically distinct concepts. So then what we start doing is we start then tracking the histories of these literatures and the ways in which certain concepts come to mean certain things and the excisions which come with that, right? So that, you know, that narratives of capitalism then are somehow to do with an internal dynamic in England, some field in England or in Europe, you know what I mean? And an empire is something that you lay over the top of that, or that may be that race is derivative or it's a function of class. And none of this to me does justice to the actual genesis of political economy itself. A very simple thing would be to say, what is the distinctive feature of capitalism? Now that question is answered usually in political economy literature by reference to capitalism in England or in Europe, right? Separated from questions of imperial conquest, land accumulation, bondage of labor, all that kind of stuff, world market, right? If you answer that question by thinking about a dynamic specific to England or Europe, which does not have any empire within it, then you would say something like, well, what is distinctive is the wage labor relation, contract, so that violence or oppression is not present at the point of surplus extraction. You would think about, relative surplus over absolute surplus, so that, it's the constant revolutionizing of the forces and means of production, which makes capital grow rather than the making people work longer hours. Those are the kind of things that you would get, right? Now you look empirically, and I mean empirically, just naively at the world, and you can see that these are not the conditions that pertain to the majority of humanity. The majority of humanity, even in the West, work longer for less, right? Majority of humanity have oppression, right? And have politics at the point of the surplus extraction. There's all different kinds of dependent and bondage labor. Servitude is the big defining feature of labor in the world, as it's been for quite a long time. Not contract, free contract. Now, if you would want to then think about that distinction and the conundrum it causes, then you would want to go back to your conceptual universe and your genealogies and think, well, have we missed something? And of course, yeah, you have missed something, because even if you just take Marx in the Communist Manifesto, what he presents is a polyglot world market with all these different forms of exploitation as well as oppression occurring at the same point in time. He might ultimately narrate it in terms of one unilinear destiny, but his analysis is not that destiny. Do you get what I'm saying? So, and that's just Marx. Then you go to Smith. Smith is all about patriarchy, preserving patriarchy and the virtues which come from that relation of dependency against commercial society. And within that, abolition is all about turning slaves into servants, into good servants. That's Adam Smith. You see what I'm saying? So for me, the stakes at play ultimately are about actually, again, it's something we come to at the beginning. Why is the world such a hieroglyph when you take these when you take these traditions of thought? Why do they make the world so hieroglyphic? You get what I'm saying? Why do you have to do so much work and so many backflips to try and explain it? Maybe it's something to do with the received genealogy of these concepts and literatures that we're using. We need to rethink that. The race in Britain is fundamentally a Commonwealth issue, right? Meaning that, from the 1920s onwards, empire becomes administered as a commonwealth, which is supposed to be much more about interdependency rather than dependency. From the 50s and 60s onwards, that commonwealth becomes, a multi-racialized commonwealth. And then all issues about race and immigration are all Commonwealth issues. Least of all because in 1948, there's a Citizen Act is made whereby all subjects of the crown across the empire are made British citizens, right? And that's only recused piece by piece from the late 60s, early 70s onwards to the early 80s when that distinction becomes separated, right? So there are, in other words, when you talk about race and international relations and political economy in Britain, you're never talking about a nation story. It simply does not make sense. Even, for example, all the organizing tools and concepts which peoples from Caribbean, African continent, South Asia, Fiji, all that these people were using in the UK were all concepts and even organizing traditions which they took from where they or their parents or grandparents had come from. Do you get what I'm saying? So there is a globality to that which is hard coded into the question of race and political economy in the UK. Now, the US, right? Yes. On the one hand, obviously, it's coming out of a settler colony, right? It's coming out of an expanding frontier. It's coming out of its own dependencies, which it captures along the way: Philippines, Puerto Rico, Haiti for a while, obviously Louisiana, Texas, California, then Hawaii, right? So it does have that element in it, but that element is less to the forefront than the confrontation with the, if you like, internal boundaries and distinctions within the US coming out of treaties with indigenous peoples and the lack thereof, or the abrogation of, and then of course enslavement and the ramifications of the afterlives of slavery, right? That then means that the race question in the US as it pertains to political economy has become far more captured by the category of the nation, right, and the US creed, right, than it has in the UK. There are good things about that because there is a creed, and I know all the terrible things about the creed, don't get me wrong, but nonetheless the pretense of the creed that there is something about liberty and justice for all, you simply do not find in the UK as an imperial entrepot. As the centre of empire, there is no creed about liberty and equality. The creed is deference and servitude, and I mean that. The unspoken, unwritten creed is deference and servitude. People put up with Boris Johnson, man. They put up with him. They will put up with people like that. You get what I'm saying? Now, where I think the argument resonates entirely is actually in the very classification of deserving, racialized classification of deserving and undeserving, and the way it shifts over time, the way it's linked into questions of disorder. There's a whole genealogy of that coming out of the freedom struggle, going from Nixon with the law and order agenda, with Reagan, with the recusing of any funds to inner cities and communities, and the replacement by policing, which we get like, the situation where we are today, right? So that is very consonant, yeah. And I think that there is something to say about the shared Anglo heritage actually in within that. And I mean, also in very recent and practical terms, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown learnt their shit from the Clintons. I mean, that's documented. You get what I'm saying? So there are, even in more recent times, there are very significant resonances in terms of people and connections. And of course, with the resurgence of white nationalism over the last few years in the US, that resurgence has also come with a kind of Anglo Empire sensibility. The dude who killed those people in the church, had a Rhodesian flag, which was the flag of, which they put up when Ian Smith said, "No, Britain, you're not going to decolonize. You're not going to decolonize us. We're going to have a declaration of unilateral independence." That flag is what this dude was bearing, right? So those are the resonances, I would say. But in other ways, it's not a simple transference. And I think, when you do comparisons, you have to be very careful about that, because comparisons can actually elide the colonial and imperial histories of these places by simply positing them as one state. So it might not help, but I mean, it's, if we're doing the kind of abolition thing, and the abolition thing would be, at least in part, an exercise in figuring the present differently. If we want to have public safety, but we don't want to have a racist and militarized police force, how would we undertake public safety? And it's the same here, right? If we believe in the principle that there are basic rights, needs for everybody, however that might be defined, and that humans, by virtue of being humans living in a place, have the right to social security, right? How do we figure that without parsing that through classifications of whole groups into deserving and undeserving before the fact? So that's not anything to do with individual character, right? That's a totally different thing. Like, I'm sure all of us know people who are quite individually are very undeserving. you get what I mean, right? That's nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the parsing of groups, right? Racializing groups into deserving and undeserving, right? And then consistently reformatting those divisions and finessing them, and then shifting them here, there, and everywhere. Like a while ago, white trash was the big thing. Now suddenly there's no white trash. Now suddenly apparently all whites are deserving. Right? But of course we know that's not actually the reality. The majority of white people are live difficult lives. Do you get what I'm saying? So all of this is consistently kind of shifting, but the basic principle is that in order to have social security, one must make racialized classifications of groups into deserving and undeserving. That principle, is a very hard-coded principle. Prefigure how we might have social security in the absence of that fundamental distinction. That, I think, is what things like Black Lives Matter and other movements as well are trying to grapple towards, trying to grasp. Empirically, it is entirely possible to see how all these things work together. So, one of my colleagues at Hopkins, Stuart Schrader, has done all this work on how a way in which the war on terror ended up militarizing the police, and that's not a US thing either. That's very there in Europe as well, right? And of course in other places. So on the one hand, empirically, one can, make all these connections, but I just hesitate to provide an explanation as a bit of a kind of caution about humility, which is that where we reside necessarily inflects what we think is important to explain. I am guilty of this as well, but all this populist authoritarian turn, well, I mean, what can I say about Philippines, about India, about Egypt, right? All this shit has been going on there in Brazil now, way more salient and concentrated, with way more detrimental consequences than in the West so far. And can I just like I said, if the move from the UK to the US intellectually is difficult, can I simply say this is all the same kind of thing, right? So I'm not saying that we can't or shouldn't make the links, but I'm just calling, myself included, for a bit of humility in terms of what we think can explain all these things. So for example, I remember very distinctly a lot of the protests and marches in the UK with Trayvon Martin and a number of people afterwards, right? And when I'm sitting in the US, I usually hear the story, oh, these guys are looking to the US. Maybe, but not really. I mean, the people I know doing that organizing were using, and I'm saying, instrumentally as well as principally, both things at the same time, the stuff happening in the US, in order to highlight all the police violence and killings of black people in the UK. And those had very, and on one level, it's very consonant, right? On another level, it has quite distinct characteristics. Even the sharing of tactics in protests and all that, between Hong Kong and Chile, and it's there and it needs to be, considered, but it can't be easily conflated into the idea that this is, one whole movement. In actual fact, what you're doing is you're actually saying that, well, these other experiences, these other histories don't need to be actually examined, committed to. There are plenty of ways to do that. I would kind of give a kind of Rastafari answer to that, which would be African redemption for the sake of humanity.